This is Lucinda, and just before we get going with this week's episode, I wanted to give you a heads up about an exciting event coming up next month. The Purpose Awards are just around the corner, taking place in London on the 6th of June, and we'd love for you to join us. The Purpose Awards ceremony celebrates campaigns driving real change and the passionate organisations behind them. Tickets are selling fast, so visit purposeawards.co.uk or click on the link in our show notes for more details.
Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Harle.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be considering the current funding situation for the voluntary sector. It should come as no surprise to hear that funders, and particularly trusts and foundations, are encountering extremely high levels of demand in the face of dips in public donations and slashed local authority budgets. And so we'd like to spend this episode considering what it feels like to be in the hot seat at a grantmaker and what the most sustainable ways forward might be.
We have two guests joining us for this discussion. First up is Lynne Guyton, Chief Executive of John Lyon's charity, a grantmaker supporting children and young people in North and West London. It has been giving out grants since 1991, but its endowment is constituted on the basis of the 16th century Royal Charter. Hello, Lynne.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And also with us is Sacha Rose-Smith, Chief Funding Director at the City Bridge Foundation, London's largest independent charity funder, which, like the John Lyon's charity, has also been around for quite some time. It was set up some 900 years ago. As well as maintaining 5 of London's bridges, it awards grants to charities. Hello, Sacha.
Hello, thank you for having me.
First things first, please tell us, what does it feel like? What are the realities of being a funder in the current climate and some of the difficult choices that you've been having to make recently?
I think, first off, I should acknowledge that actually the work we do is an absolute privilege to be in a trust and foundation. And I constantly tell the team that any challenges and scrutiny we face pales in comparison to what the sector is having to put up with and deal with and delivering services on the ground. But having said that, all professions and all organisations have difficulties and challenges. To be a funder at the moment, I think there are a couple of main challenges, one of which is unprecedented demand. It's something that I've been doing this for 15 odd years and I've never seen demand like it. And I think that's really difficult to manage. I think the other thing that is happening, quite rightly, is enhanced scrutiny on trusts and foundations, from everything around looking at their power, their accountability, their transparency, their diversity. And all of those things are really necessary and important, but it's doing so in a really meaningful way. The scrutiny on foundations and actually the increased demand is making things very challenging for trusts and foundations.
And Lynne, going to you, what's your take on the current climate and being a funder right now?
As Sacha has said, we've never seen demand quite like we're seeing now. I think there are a number of factors for that. There's been a drop in donations from the public to public-facing charities. I mean, for ourselves as a trust and foundation with a large endowment, that's not the biggest issue for us. The biggest issue is just the increased demand. We're seeing charities increasingly coming to us and schools for costs that previously would have been picked up by local authorities or indeed central government. And so our funding used to be considered value added or a nice to have. It's now considered part of an essential funding pot within a school or within a charity.
And how long have you been in that situation? When did that uptick really begin?
So I would say beginning with the previous government, really looking at austerity as having a really negative impact as a policy across the social sector and the impact that had upon charities. There's almost been a triple whammy. We've seen austerity, we've seen COVID, and then we've seen most recently a cost of living crisis. And I think those three different things over a period of around 12 years has meant that what the sector needs from central government and local authorities is just not there. And so those on the ground charities are turning to funders like City Bridge and John Lyon's Foundation to fill those gaps.
With that increased demand, What does that mean, practically speaking, on a day-to-day basis in terms of how the foundation is running? Have you had to make big changes in terms of your operations? Have you found that you just don't have enough money to be giving out at the moment, or you've just got to be more strategic?
So there are a number of things that we have done. First of all, we've had several strategies. So we typically have 5-year strategies. So during my tenure, this is the second 5-year strategy that we're on. But we don't pause our funding. And I know we might come on to this. So I've made a decision, particularly coming from banking, coming from business, where if you're a business, you just you don't have that luxury to pause and think about what your next strategy is. So we've carried on. I think it was to think about strategically, where do we place our funding? How can we ensure that the groups that most need our funding receive it? So we've looked at giving larger grants for longer. Typically, we used to give grants of around 30, 40k per annum for 3 years. Now we're giving 50k a year for 5 years. So there's a big difference between 90k and $250,000. And that's from feedback from grantees saying we need to feel that we are sustainable. We need to feel that 3 years of funding is fantastic, but actually after the first year, we're starting to think about how we fundraise again. So there's something about giving that back to those on the ground charities, that we are listening to them about what they need. Our criteria we've tightened to make sure that we're not getting charities from outside of our beneficial area applying, or outside of children and young people's charities applying. We've tried to make that clearer on our website. The other thing that we've done in response to austerity, COVID, etc., is actually to dig deeper into our endowment. And I've gone back to my trustees to say, this really is the rainy day. So instead of just using our normal formula for how much we grant each year, we've decided to give additional monies. So to dig deeper into the endowment and say, we're going to give another 22 million over 6 years in response to COVID. So not to flood the market in one go at the very beginning, but to give a sustained response over 6 years. We weren't going to be able to save every single community organisation or charity during that difficult period, but we've been able to save a lot, and we've really focused on what we would term the community critical organisations that we know and work with.
And Sacha, in contrast, Citybridge Foundation is soon to come out of the other end of a funding pause. And we've seen a lot of grant makers having to do this in order to review their strategies, etc., which Citybridge has also done. So for our listeners, can you tell them a bit about what prompted that pause right at the beginning and what you've been doing throughout that duration?
We were one of 40 that actually paused last year, which I recognise has a real impact on the sector. I think firstly, I'd say it was an incredibly difficult decision to make, and nobody takes that decision lightly. I remember sitting down one Sunday morning and looking at our pipeline and looking at all the applications coming in and looking at the budgets and saying, no, can't do this anymore. And we explored all our options. We took a paper to our board. One of the things we did first was we tightened our criteria, as Lynne has said, and we also did a partial pause. So we didn't want to do a full sort of pause for the sector. So we did do a partial pause in July last year, and then we tracked all of the applications coming in, the budget that we had. And then we had to sadly make the decision to do a full pause in October last year. Now, I think it was irresponsible for us to stay open when organisations are spending, a huge amount of time and effort putting in applications to us that really don't have any chance of being funded. And that didn't feel responsible to stay open in that circumstance. What we have been doing, but I also would like to say, I think it's hard probably for the sector to sometimes think, well, if a trust or a foundation has paused, what are they actually doing? But we've achieved an incredible amount during that time. So I'm very proud of the team who we've processed close to 1,000 applications. At the end of the last financial year, we have awarded close to £80 million to the sector, 10 million of which was towards a suicide prevention funding programme, which is the largest suicide prevention funding programme the capital has ever seen. And in conjunction with that, we've been undertaking extensive consultation for our new funding policy. We did 6 engagement sessions. We did a survey of 1,000 Londoners. And concurrent to that, we are looking at an end-to-end review, a wholesale of all of our funding practices and processes in order to try to be a better funder. So there is an awful lot that's been going on in that time that we have actually paused.
Great to hear about all the different things that you've been doing in that time. Lynne, what's your take on Sacha's thoughts that continuing at the time that they were in the situation that the City Bridge Foundation was in was irresponsible?
I mean, obviously, I don't know the ins and outs of what goes on the City Bridge board. It clearly was a very difficult decision to make. From our perspective, it wasn't something that we felt we either needed or wanted to do. We are one of the largest funders of children and young people within London, and we felt that it would be irresponsible, conversely to City Bridge, to actually close our funding whilst we thought about how our strategy might develop. City Bridge has been an enormous funder throughout London for many, many years. And I think it's because it has been such a large funder and so many charities have been reliant upon it, why it caused such a stir when the funding was paused. So I completely understand why that decision was taken. It's not been without criticism from, across the sector.
But I think it's also reflective of the fact that, like other trusts and foundations, and you have said yourself, we made additional funds available to the sector at a really critical time. We released an additional £200 million to the sector, and we didn't do it in 1 year. We've done it tapered over a number of years. And I think in part that does drive behaviour and expectation in the sector. And I think a lot of trusts and foundations are having to refocus and look at what it's like to return to normal levels of giving.
And one of the things that Sacha mentioned previously was that City Bridge Foundation was one of about 40 grantmakers that closed their programmes last year, which is not a number to scoff at. Lynne, I was wondering, how have these closures among the grant-making sector, how has that affected John Lyon's charity in terms of the applications you're receiving?
We have seen an increase in applications to us. So over the last 3 years, in fact, there are more than 40 foundations that have paused or closed their funding. There is, can't remember who it is, but there's somebody on LinkedIn that is compiling, they are like a consultant to the sector. There's a spreadsheet which shows all of the different funders that are pausing or have paused funding. And it's quite a live spreadsheet, so you can see actually who has now reopened their funding, etc.
That's Joe Jeffrey. It is a fantastic resource.
It's eye-opening to see quite how many funds are pausing. And they're all pausing for slightly different reasons. But for us, we are seeing an increase in our funding. And where we fund satellite charities like the John Lyon's Young People Foundations, we're seeing that the impact is occurring on them as well. So they're not being able to attract as much funding. So they're coming back to us for increased funding as well. So yes, it's having an impact. So we're having to be, more draconian in how we decide to review grants and how we decide to recommend grants to our board.
And are you finding that you're having to turn away significant numbers of very worthy applicants who are working in the space that you fund?
So not so much turning away. As I said, we're looking to give larger grants for longer periods of time. Now, some smaller charities might not be able to cope with that amount of money. They're not large enough to be able to receive that type of grant. And so we introduced a new fund called a Gateway Grant, which is for those newer or smaller organisations that perhaps haven't had grants from us before, to get them on the first ladder, to be able to see, okay, maybe you're only having 20k a year for 3 years. Let's see how we go. Let's see if we can move you on. But there are some where in the past we'd funded them and maybe they only have 3 people, maybe they're doing anti-bullying work, things like that. But in terms of our strategy going forward, we're saying, if you're not going to grow, you're not eligible for this grant, you're not eligible for that grant, we're going to have to part company. But what we will always do is signpost to other trusts and foundations and other charities that might be able to help.
Sacha, you spoke about the journey that the City Bridge Foundation was on and the work that you've been doing since you paused funding. You unveiled a new strategy in March and you have plans to reopen applications in the autumn, if I'm not mistaken. Tell us about your new strategy and how it is responding to increased demand and this very difficult situation that charities find themselves in.
Sure. So we did launch our new policy, Standing with Londoners, which is a 10-year policy. City Bridge Foundation, we've always talked about equality, we've talked about fairness, but the new policy sort of positions us quite explicitly around social justice. And what I mean by that is really we're looking to support those most marginalised, those most affected by injustice, and take a more systemic approach around prevention and root causes. And we are being much more focused in our policy, and we're focusing on 4 what we're calling justice visions. These are high-level entry points, and that's around climate justice, access to justice, racial justice, and economic inequality. And we are doing the work now in terms of developing the actual programmes that will sit under that. And we will launch our first programme this autumn, which will be Access to Justice. We will develop our further programmes and they will follow after in 2026. We're managing demand, I think, in a few ways. One, we've been on a journey from being incredibly broad generalist funder to be much more focused. And I think that's really important to offer clarity to the sector about what we will and won't fund moving forward. A couple of the things that we are introducing is, it sounds silly when I say it, but pre-application calls, the ability to actually pick up a phone and talk to a human being about whether to submit an application or not. And that's really hard to do when you're a volume funder and you have so many open programmes, but that ability for people to be able to talk to us. And also we will have a 2-stage application process, so more of a lighter touch expression of interest before people move on to a full application. So those are some of the ways in which we're trying to manage demand moving forward.
That's how we've operated for a number of years. And like you, we're London based, but we know our grantees and we know the sector well. We've got the luxury of only funding children and young people's charities in North and West London. And so we visit those areas regularly. We have the pre-application calls, and I think that filters out some of that demand, or it sorts the wheat from the chaff, in terms of being able to really understand who should be applying, who should put in the first stage application, and then we'll go over the second stage application in more detail with them. I completely agree on that. I do absolutely get that you were a very, very broad-based funder. So I know you gave a lot to the children and young people sector as well, because we've often collaborated on grants. But it's hard if you're doing everything. Yeah. It is really hard. And so I appreciate by focusing it, you're going to be able to have a greater impact, I think, in just 3 or 4 key areas.
And I think that's really important, because I think part of the responsibility of being a trust and foundation is understanding your place in the system and where you think you can have the most impact. And that might be by working in collaboration with other trusts and foundations. It might be about leading in certain areas, or it might actually be about stepping back. So I think actually being able to understand your place is also really important.
And I wanted to ask a question on that point of really focusing in on specific areas. And Lynne, you also mentioned that you tightened your criteria a bit as well. So this is a question to both of you, but I'll go to you first, Sacha. Can you tell me a bit about what the response has been like in terms of that tightened focus? Have you had any feedback from charities that may have been eligible previously but are now not? And how are you dealing with that?
I think in terms of the response from the sector, we've had a really overwhelmingly positive response in terms of our new strategy. The sector's been crying out for a long time for us to focus on prevention and root causes, and that's been warmly welcomed. Inevitably, when you move from a position of being really broad and funding in lots of areas and then you narrow down, the sector will be nervous around what does this mean for them. And we will be much more focused. That means, unfortunately, there are some areas that we funded previously that we will no longer be able to do so or do less of. I think it's important that we continue the dialogue with other funders around understanding, where they are funding and where we're not and where we can work together. I think that's a really important part of what we do. But no trust or foundation can be everything to everyone. Understanding where you can have the most impact, I think, is the most responsible thing to do.
And Lynne, I see you nodding there as well.
I completely agree. And I think even for us, where we are, so although we're focused on children and young people, within that, we're looking at where we can have the most impact. So we are doing a lot of advocacy work and funding around special educational needs and disabilities, emotional well-being in schools. And the thought leadership around those two pieces has meant that we are engaging with government, central and local government, much more involved in the disability poverty action workforce with government to try and advise, look, these are tried and tested models that we've been funding for many years. These are models that could be rolled out further than London. So I think for us, it's about where are those pockets that we can really see that our funding is making a really big difference.
And are you finding that's had to happen at the expense of some areas that you previously funded and you've had to say, I'm really sorry, but we can't do this anymore?
There aren't areas where we've absolutely said, right, we're not funding anymore. But for example, if I think about sport, so we used to fund the Chelsea FC, the charity part of that. They do great community work, but when you think about how wealthy Chelsea Football Club is, it's probably not the best use of our money. They can get funding from elsewhere. We would rather put that into providing an emotional wellbeing counsellor into a hub of local schools that can make use of that facility, for example.
Sacha, you mentioned that there are areas that regrettably you're not funding anymore as you focus on social justice going forward. And you also mentioned collaborating and the need to talk with other funders. I wonder, did you do any funder mapping exercise to inform your decision around dropping funding to a particular area? And I'd be really grateful if you could tell us of one area that you are no longer funding because it is being covered by XYZ funder or foundation or whatever.
I think that conversation and that work is ongoing because at the moment we've not developed our programmes. We've got our policy, but the real work now in terms of developing that programmes and that eligibility criteria. One of the things we did through the consultation process is we did 2 roundtables with other funders who are either place-based within London or had a majority share in London, if you like, to really map and understand who is funding what and where the gaps are. And actually, one of the things that came out really strongly that we heard from other funders is don't stop funding infrastructure, because we actually have a really long tradition of funding infrastructure support. And that is something that we have committed to in our new funding policy. And we wanted to respond to that and recognise that we do have a role and we will continue to have a role in funding infrastructure support in the sector. I think it's too early to say that there's definitely like we will no longer fund this or we will no longer fund that. We've said we'll focus on a range of things, and those are meeting needs, because although I talk about prevention and root causes, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We recognise that meeting needs is actually really important, but it may be a smaller part of what we do. So we will still continue to do that. We will look to connect communities and fund capacity building and leadership support and infrastructure. The newer part of the work for us is around catalysing change. And it builds on what Lynne said actually about the work that you're doing around special education, which is really interesting. For us, actually, what does it look like to fund advocacy, to fund campaigns and to fund community organising, to look at actually supporting a group of organisations and actors who are working towards a common goal? And I think in a more systemic way, that's a new area for us. So those sort of 3 elements are something that will feature in terms of all of our funding programmes moving forward.
And Lynne, going to you on the point of collaboration, do you think that there's a need for more collaboration within the funding space? And if so, how can that be done more effectively than it is currently?
So I think there is strong collaboration between funders. I mean, both Sacha and I sit on a variety of different forums. So there have been fantastic examples over the last 8 years of both of our organisations and many others coming together for a response to COVID, a response to Grenfell, and a response to the cost of living as well. So I think in terms of crisis funding, we've been really good at coming together very quickly, very effectively, and putting systems in place to try and make it as easy as possible for applicants to apply for emergency funding. I think in terms of like longer term, what I would call like peacetime funding, we're still collaborating on that. There's lots of work going on, but it's slightly harder because each organisation has got their own board, their own set of values, not quite sure, how much money do we really want to give over to a collaboration pot. But we certainly do collaborate when it comes to grant making, and when a number of us are funding the same grantee, we will swap notes. We will say, this is a great organisation. We funded them for 5 years. It might be something that you're interested in funding as well. So we do have those conversations, and also then around grant making practice as well. We've spoken about how you define your criteria, etc., etc. We're constantly engaging around what's the best way to do that. At the end of the day, we're all trying to make our systems as robust as possible, but also to not try to outwit the grantees that are applying. We're not trying to trip them up. It's about making sure that the applications are fit for purpose and that we can fund them. And actually, we want to see them as partners rather than us just bestowing a grant in a quite patrician-like way.
And interesting, talking about peacetime, I can imagine that quite a lot of overworked charity professionals listening will be like, if this is how it's going to be going forward, then it's going to be very difficult for us to continue. But what are your views on the sort of longer term outlook for the sector in light of problematic public sector funding? How can trusts and foundations sustain themselves and make sure that they are adequately responding to the needs of charities at the moment and going forward in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I think for trusts and foundations that have got endowments, it's about making sure that the endowments are secure, that they're properly managed, and that you've got the right type of professionals on your investment committee. So most of the large funders that I'm aware of do. I think it will be a rocky ride from an investment returns perspective over the next 5 years or so. So that's something that could affect the amount available to spend. I don't think central or local government are going to provide much more. I think those days are long gone in terms of providing for the things that we provide. It's a question of how can we be more nimble? How can we ensure that the organisations, the grantees we're supporting are the right organisations to make an impact within their area?
And Sacha, what are your thoughts on the longer term outlook? Hopefully City Bridge Foundation will be well primed, given that you've done all of this groundwork over the past few months.
I hope so, but I think the challenge is to always be questioning, always be looking at how you can improve, how you can do things differently. And I think we have a real spirit around continuous improvement at City Bridge Foundation. And we say that how you fund is as important as what and who you fund as well, and think that that is really important. I think everything Lynne has said I would agree with. We have made a decision in our new policy to focus on long-term core funding and unrestricted funding where we can, being a London-only funder. And I think that's really important for the sector to have that security around long-term core or unrestricted funding. I think to try to be as open and transparent as we can around what we can fund, what we can't fund, and just to be responsive. I'm a hopeful realist in the sense that I think things are really tough for the sector, and I think it has become the new normal of crises after crises. But one thing that the civil society is amazing at is coming through. The innovation, the willingness to work together to achieve social change is always incredible. So I am always hopeful.
And for people from charities who are listening to this podcast today and wondering how they can maximise their success when applying for funding, Lynne, can you tell us some top tips for charities who are seeking funding from John Lyons?
Sure. So I think the first port of call would be to go to our website to look at the grants criteria on the website. That's got examples of grants that have succeeded, the type of grants that organisations can apply for. But secondly, to call us. Our contact details are on the website, so call. If in doubt, call.
Thank you. And Sacha, any advice that you would like to share with our audience, who may include charities that are looking to get funding from the City Bridge Foundation going forward?
I agree with Lynne that I think the ability to look and really understand the criteria that's put out, and when we develop our criteria in the autumn, I would really encourage people to read it and understand it and get in touch with us. I don't think there's a kind of silver bullet of what makes an amazing funding application. It is really competitive out there. I think for me, in the kind of years I've been doing this, I would say to organisations to have clarity. If you're not clear, then we're not clear. So just being clear about what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, and how you're trying to do it. We want people to be ambitious, but also realistic. We know you're not going to change the world for £75,000. We're here to support you and understand the context that you're operating within. So I think that realism about what you can and can't do. And I think the last thing I would say is the centering of lived experience, I think, is really important to us. So how do you demonstrate that in your governance or your service delivery? I think that's very important as well.
Well, that seems like a great note to end it on. Lynne and Sacha, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Lynne and Sacha. And if you'd like to read more about why some grant makers are pausing their programmes, including further comments from Sacha, you can read Emily's analysis piece, which is linked in the show notes to this episode. And that's it for now. We'll be back next week to hear how the Drive Forward Foundation is shifting to a more strategic model for its corporate partnerships. But for now, from Emily and me and everyone at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.